The United States carries a financial burden of $36 trillion. China's obligations amount to $15 trillion. Japan is indebted to the tune of $10 trillion. Germany owes $3 trillion, as does the United Kingdom. France's commitment stands at $3.5 trillion. Every prominent nation across the globe finds itself in a state of indebtedness. The sum total of global liabilities reaches a staggering $317 trillion. That figure, $317 trillion, represents 330% of the world's gross domestic product. The entire output of goods and services generated by the planet in 1 year falls short of the total outstanding debt. To discharge this debt, we would require 3 full years of global productivity, with absolutely no consumption. However, a crucial question remains unaddressed. If every nation is in debt, who precisely is the entity to whom this debt is owed? Who holds assets valued at $317 trillion? If the rest of the world collectively bears liabilities totaling $317 trillion, then someone, somewhere, possesses claims to $317 trillion in global assets. The identity of this entity reveals the most significant mechanism for wealth concentration ever witnessed in human history. This accumulation of wealth has not been achieved through military conquest or outright theft, but rather through a sophisticated system where the multitude borrows and a select few lend, where interest accrues indefinitely, and where the very mathematics of debt render full repayment impossible, leading to perpetual growth and a constant siphoning of wealth upwards. Herein lies the revelation of who truly holds the $317 trillion of global debt. We will explore how this system engenders debt without concurrently generating the means for its repayment. We will uncover why this is an intentional design, not an accidental crisis, and which specific institutions and individuals profit from this unending cycle of debt. Furthermore, we will examine why this system is destined for eventual collapse, but only after maximizing wealth extraction. Understanding this is not merely an economic exercise, it is about recognizing the global debt system as the engine that concentrates wealth into fewer hands, all while presenting this concentration as a natural and unavoidable phenomenon. Before we identify the holders of this debt, it is imperative to grasp the true nature of debt within our contemporary economic framework. Most individuals conceive of debt in terms of personal borrowing. Imagine taking out a $10,000 loan from a bank. The bank, possessing that $10,000, lends it to you. Upon repayment, the bank not only recovers its initial $10,000, but also earns interest. This, however, is not how modern debt operates. When a government issues bonds to secure funds, the money does not pre-exist the act of borrowing. The very act of issuing debt brings the money into existence. Central banks or commercial banks acquire these government bonds by creating money ex nihilo through mere ledger entries. Suppose the United States government requires $1 trillion. It issues treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve then declares its intention to purchase $500 billion worth of these bonds. Commercial banks acquire the remaining $500 billion. The question then arises, where does the Federal Reserve procure $500 billion? It does not possess such funds. It generates this money by inputting figures into a computer. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expands by $500 billion in assets and an equivalent sum in liabilities. Commercial banks employ a similar process through fractional reserve banking. The money in question did not exist prior to this transaction. It now exists solely due to the bond purchase. Consequently, when the U.S. government borrows $1 trillion, that $1 trillion is effectively created through the borrowing process itself. However, a critical distinction emerges. Only the principal amount is created. The interest due is not simultaneously generated. If the government borrows $1 trillion at a 5% interest rate, it is obligated to repay not only the initial $1 trillion, but also an additional $50 billion in interest annually. Yet only the initial $1 trillion was brought into existence. The $50 billion required to cover the annual interest must originate from an external source. This source could be future borrowing or taxation of the existing money supply. This creates a mathematical predicament. The aggregate amount of debt invariably surpasses the total money supply, because interest is owed on borrowed sums, but this interest was never initially created. The system necessitates continuous debt expansion simply to service existing interest obligations. This is not an oversight. It is by design. Now let us elucidate who holds this debt. The answer comprises four principal categories of creditors. Firstly, central banks. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion of United States government debt. The Bank of Japan possesses $5 trillion in Japanese government debt. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion in European government debt. The People's Bank of China holds $3 trillion in Chinese government debt. Globally, central banks collectively hold approximately $25 trillion in government bonds, representing 8% of the total $317 trillion in debt. Crucially, this forms the bedrock of the system, as central banks create money to purchase government bonds, thereby enabling governments to spend beyond their tax revenues. The question then becomes, who owns these central banks? The Federal Reserve, contrary to popular belief, is not government-owned. It is a private entity owned by its member banks. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks issue shares to their constituent commercial banks. Institutions such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo receive an annual dividend of 6% on their holdings of Federal Reserve shares. When the Federal Reserve acquires $5 trillion in government bonds and subsequently receives interest payments, this interest ultimately flows to the private banks that own the Federal Reserve. The public perceives the Federal Reserve as an arm of the government, which is inaccurate. It is, in fact, a private banking cartel established in 1913 to allow private banks to profit from government debt. The Bank of England, established in 1694, was explicitly founded as a private institution tasked with lending money to the government. King William III required financing for a war against France. Parliament sanctioned the creation of the Bank of England as a private enterprise. This bank provided a loan of $1.2 million to the government, and in return was granted the exclusive privilege of issuing currency. From its inception, central banks have served as mechanisms for private bankers to profit through the creation of government debt. While ownership structures have become more intricate today, the fundamental principle remains identical. Central banks generate money, extend it to governments through bond acquisitions, and receive interest payments funded by taxpayers. Secondly, institutional investors. This broad category encompasses pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and sovereign wealth funds. These institutions collectively hold approximately $120 trillion in global debt. Pension funds account for $50 trillion, insurance companies for $35 trillion, mutual funds for $25 trillion, and sovereign wealth funds for $10 trillion. The pertinent question, however, is who owns these institutions? Pension funds are, in principle, owned by the workers whose pensions they manage. Yet these workers do not exercise control over these institutions. Control resides with the fund managers. Furthermore, fund managers' compensation is contingent upon the assets under their management. Insurance companies are owned by shareholders. Companies like MetLife, Prudential, and AIG are publicly traded entities, but their share ownership is highly concentrated. The top 10% of households possess 89% of all stocks and bonds. Consequently, insurance companies are, in effect, owned by the wealthy. Mutual funds, such as Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, manage $20 trillion in assets. Vanguard is theoretically owned by its fund investors, but actual control rests with its management. BlackRock and State Street are publicly traded corporations whose ownership is concentrated among wealthy shareholders. Across all institutional investors, the consistent pattern is that control is vested in a small managerial class, and the ultimate economic benefits disproportionately accrue to the wealthy. Thirdly, foreign governments. Foreign governments collectively hold approximately $30 trillion in debt issued by other nations. China, for instance, possesses $3.2 trillion in foreign assets, including $850 billion in United States Treasury bonds. Japan holds $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. The rationale behind foreign governments holding the debt of other nations lies within the structure of international trade. When China exports $500 billion more to America than it imports, China receives $500 billion in U.S. currency. China then utilizes these dollars to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds. In the short term, this arrangement appears mutually beneficial. America secures cheaper goods, and China finances its purchases by lending the money back. However, this fosters long-term dependency. Within China, who truly benefits from holding trillions in foreign bonds? It is not the average Chinese worker. The Chinese government holds these bonds, controlled by the elite of the Communist Party. Fourthly, wealthy individuals and family offices. The wealthiest 1% globally holds approximately $40 trillion in financial assets, a significant portion of which is invested in bonds. The top 0.1% controls $20 trillion. The top 0.01%, comprising approximately 500,000 families worldwide, holds $10 trillion. These families, including the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Mars family, the Koch family, and the Saudi royal family, manage vast portfolios of bonds. When an individual possesses $10 billion in wealth, a prudent investment strategy involves acquiring government and corporate bonds, assets that yield interest safely. A family with $10 billion invested in bonds at a 4% interest rate generates $400 million annually in interest income. They do not engage in labor or produce goods. They simply collect $400 million each year from interest paid by borrowers. This represents the core mechanism by which wealth is concentrated through debt. The affluent lend to everyone else and perpetually collect interest. This interest is repaid through taxation, through profit extraction from workers by corporations, and through mortgage payments. Thus, wealth is channeled from the many to the few via the debt system. Summing these four categories: central banks hold $25 trillion, institutional investors hold $120 trillion, foreign governments hold $30 trillion, and wealthy individuals hold $40 trillion. This accounts for $215 trillion out of the total $317 trillion. The remaining $12 trillion is held by smaller institutional investors, corporate treasuries, middle-class savers with bond funds in their retirement accounts, and various other entities. However, even this remaining portion is disproportionately held by the wealthy, given the inherent concentration of wealth. The bottom 50% of the global population possesses virtually no financial assets. They are the borrowers, burdened by mortgages, student loans, credit card debt, and car loans. Conversely, the top 10% holds the vast majority of financial assets, making them the lenders. Therefore, the answer to the question of who the lender is lies with the wealthy. Operating through central banks they influence, institutions they own, and direct holdings they manage, the debt system functions as a conduit for wealth transfer from the less affluent, the borrowers, to the rich, the lenders. Now let us examine how this mechanism has operated throughout history. Consider medieval Europe, between 1200 and 1500 AD. The Catholic Church served as the principal lender. Monarchs routinely borrowed from the church to finance their military campaigns. By the year 1500, the Catholic Church had acquired ownership of 25% of all land in Europe, largely through foreclosures stemming from unpaid debts. The Medici family in Florence during the 1400s ascended to become the wealthiest family in Europe through their lending activities. They extended credit to kings, popes, and merchants. The income generated from interest payments on loans surpassed the profits derived from any commercial enterprise. By 1450, the Medici's influence was so profound that they could appoint popes and sway the decisions of monarchs. The establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 marked the formalization of the debt-based wealth system. King William III required $1.2 million to fund a war. Parliament authorized the creation of a private bank that would provide this loan to the government. In exchange, the bank would receive interest paid by taxpayers and would be granted the exclusive right to issue currency. This served as the foundational blueprint. Establish a private institution with a government-granted monopoly on money creation. This institution then lends to the government. Taxpayers subsequently pay interest to this private entity. The shareholders of this institution amass wealth through perpetual interest income. The Rothschild family in the 1800s perfected this model. Mayer Amschel Rothschild dispatched his 5 sons to 5 major European capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Each son established a bank. The family proceeded to lend to every European government. Following the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the Rothschilds held more government debt than any other family in history. Nathan Rothschild in London famously declared, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." By 1850, the Rothschild family was estimated to possess 50% of all government bonds in Europe. They collected interest from every major European nation. The wealth they accumulated through lending exceeded the wealth of most individual nations. J.P. Morgan, in early 1900s America, employed a similar strategy. Morgan lent to governments, railroads, and industrial corporations. By 1912, Morgan controlled banks that held 25% of all financial assets in America. The pattern observed over 800 years remains consistent. Those who lend amass wealth, while those who borrow become dependent. Lenders accumulate wealth through interest income without engaging in production. Borrowers, conversely, labor and produce but are perpetually indebted, owing ever-increasing sums. The system is meticulously engineered to ensure that the debt can never be fully repaid. The mathematical trap is straightforward. When money is created through debt, only the principal is generated, not the accrued interest. This inherently means that there is always more debt outstanding than actual money available. If the total global money supply were $100 trillion, but the total debt, including interest, amounted to $120 trillion, it would be mathematically impossible to satisfy all outstanding obligations. The sole recourse for servicing existing debt is to create new debt. This involves borrowing new funds specifically to cover the interest payments on prior loans. This process inevitably inflates the total debt burden, necessitating even greater levels of new borrowing. Consequently, the debt grows exponentially. This explains the dramatic increase in global debt from $40 trillion in 1990 to $317 trillion by 2025, a 7.9-fold increase in just 35 years. The debt effectively doubles approximately every 10 years. Furthermore, this growth is not optional. It is an imperative, because if the creation of new debt ceases, there will be insufficient funds to cover interest on existing debt, leading to systemic collapse. The architects of this system were acutely aware of this dynamic. The founders of the Bank of England in 1694 understood that once the government borrowed $1.2 million, it would be perpetually incapable of full repayment, as the interest owed would inevitably exceed the prevailing money supply. This is not a flaw in the system, it is its central feature. Perpetual debt translates to perpetual interest income, which in turn facilitates perpetual wealth transfer from borrowers to lenders. Now, let us examine who benefits from this system in today's economy. In the year 2024, global interest payments on the $317 trillion of debt approximated $15 trillion. This represents $15 trillion flowing from borrowers to lenders within a single year. Governments discharge their interest obligations through taxation. The United States government expends $900 billion annually in interest payments on its $36 trillion national debt. This $900 billion is sourced from taxpayers and is directed to bondholders. Corporations meet their interest obligations through profit extraction. Globally, corporations carry $90 trillion in debt and disperse approximately $5 trillion in annual interest. The origin of these funds is the differential between the wages paid to employees and the prices charged to consumers. Households also contribute to interest payments, primarily through their earnings. Households globally are indebted to the tune of $60 trillion and pay approximately $3 trillion in annual interest. Consider a family earning $70,000 per year, who pays $15,000 in mortgage interest and $5,000 in other interest. This amounts to 29% of their income being channeled to creditors. Therefore, the $15 trillion in annual interest payments flows from taxpayers, workers, and households upwards to central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals. The wealthiest 1% globally captures approximately 40% of these annual interest payments, totaling $6 trillion per year, distributed amongst 80 million people. The top 0.1% secures 20% of this, amounting to $3 trillion for 8 million individuals. The top 0.01%, comprising roughly 800,000 people, receives 10%, or $1.5 trillion. Thus, 800,000 individuals accrue $1.5 trillion annually from interest income derived from a debt system that obligates 8 billion people as either borrowers or taxpayers funding these payments. This equates to approximately $1.975 million per person within the top 0.01%, solely from interest income. This is the precise mechanism of wealth concentration. Debt systematically funnels wealth from billions of individuals to millions, then to thousands, and finally to a select few hundred families at the very apex. This concentration is further accelerated by the compounding effect of interest. If one receives $10 million in annual interest income, that sum is reinvested into purchasing more bonds, which in turn generate additional interest, which is then used to acquire even more bonds. Wealth compounds exponentially for creditors, while debtors remain ensnared in a perpetual cycle of repayment. In 1850, the Rothschild family possessed $2 billion in assets. Adjusted for inflation and accounting for 175 years of compound interest, their wealth is now estimated to be between $500 billion and $1 trillion. They did not build this fortune through enterprise. They lent money and collected interest for 7 generations. This pattern is replicated across virtually every affluent family. While initial wealth may have been established through business ventures, perpetual affluence is maintained through lending. They acquire bonds, collect interest, and reinvest those earnings. The system effectively guarantees the unending growth of their wealth, provided the debt system itself remains operational. And this system must persist because its cessation would precipitate a catastrophic collapse of the entire economic structure. Governments rely on debt to function. Corporations require debt to expand. Households depend on debt to finance the purchase of homes, vehicles, and education. The entirety of the modern economy is fundamentally structured upon debt, and debt, by definition, necessitates creditors. These creditors are, unequivocally, the wealthy, and the wealthy leverage the debt system to extract wealth from everyone else through perpetual interest payments, which can never cease because the debt itself can never be fully repaid. However, this system possesses an inherent mathematical limit. Debt cannot expand indefinitely. Global debt currently stands at 330% of GDP. Debt is growing at an annual rate of 7%, while GDP is expanding at 3%. If current trends persist, global debt will exceed 400% of GDP by 2035. At such a threshold, interest payments alone would consume 40% of global GDP, an unsustainable scenario. Something is bound to break. Options include government defaults, which would decimate bondholders but trigger financial system collapse, governments engaging in inflation, which transfers wealth through currency devaluation but erodes savings, or governments implementing debt jubilees, which cancel debt but fundamentally restructure society. All 3 of these outcomes would disproportionately harm the middle class, whose wealth is tied to depreciating assets, while the elite possessing hard assets, diversified currencies, and geographically dispersed holdings would remain largely protected. This outcome is by design. The system was conceived to concentrate wealth during both periods of economic expansion and periods of contraction. During expansion, the wealthy accrue interest on perpetual debt. During contraction, the wealthy acquire assets at deeply discounted prices from bankrupt borrowers. This phenomenon was evident during the Great Depression, when wealthy investors purchased farms from foreclosed smallholders, transforming former farmers into tenant laborers. This also occurred in 2008, when homeowners defaulted on their mortgages, leading private equity firms like BlackRock and Invitation Homes to acquire hundreds of thousands of homes at substantial discounts. Homeownership declined, while corporate ownership of residential property surged. This pattern is poised to repeat in the next crisis. When the debt system falters, the middle class, burdened by debt, will default. The wealthy, holding assets, will then acquire these defaulted assets at significantly reduced valuations. The $317 trillion debt system is not a crisis. It is a sophisticated wealth extraction mechanism, meticulously designed to transfer wealth from the many to the few, irrespective of prevailing economic conditions. An escape from this system is virtually impossible, given its global reach and all-encompassing nature. You pay interest on your mortgage to a bank owned by shareholders who are overwhelmingly wealthy. You pay taxes that effectively service government debt, which is owned by bondholders who are also disproportionately wealthy. Every economic transaction incorporates an interest component that invariably flows upwards. The average American pays approximately $20,000 annually in direct and indirect interest payments. Over the course of a lifetime, this amounts to $1.4 million in interest paid, flowing from you to creditors who are, on average, 100 times wealthier than you. This is the essence of the system. Generate money through debt, charge interest, collect perpetually, concentrate wealth in the hands of creditors, and ensure the debt is unpayable so that interest collection never ceases. The question concerning the $317 trillion has a definitive answer. The lenders are a select global elite. They operate through central banks they control, institutions they own, and direct investments they manage. They are the creditors to the rest of humanity. The interest payments flowing from 8 billion people to the top few million constitute the largest wealth transfer in human history, occurring daily and invisibly embedded within every economic transaction. However, even the eventual collapse of the system will ultimately benefit the creditor class, as they will convert their intangible financial claims into tangible hard assets during the ensuing crisis. The system extracts wealth during periods of growth and during periods of collapse. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Now you know. It is the individuals who architected the system to ensure their perpetual position as creditors, while everyone else remains perpetually indebted. This intricate apparatus, functioning on a foundation of $317 trillion in outstanding obligations and generating $15 trillion each year through accrued charges, serves as the engine driving the contemporary worldwide financial landscape. It facilitates a ceaseless and unavoidable redistribution of prosperity, moving it inexorably from the lower strata to the highest echelons. Should this exposition illuminate the true holders of the $317 trillion in worldwide indebtedness and reveal the deliberate design of the debt framework as an instrument for wealth appropriation, then consider subscribing, as the subsequent installment will unveil the ultimate conclusion. What transpires when $317 trillion escalates to $500 trillion and the interest levied surpasses the entire global gross domestic product? There are three conceivable resolutions: repudiation of the debt, devaluation of currency, or a comprehensive cancellation of obligations. The video will elucidate which of these scenarios the influential powers are strategically preparing for and the underlying rationale. Each of these three eventualities results in a further concentration of wealth at the apex, draining resources from the middle demographic. The query concerning $37 trillion possesses a definitive response. The quandary of $500 trillion, however, points towards what lies ahead, and the resolution to that question will dictate whether you safeguard your assets or suffer total impoverishment when the existing debt structure ultimately collapses.